Now to take us on to the next part of our activity, we have Lanre Akinola, who's the editor with the Financial Times of the This Is Africa series. Lanre, over to you.
Thank you very much, Graham. One thing I'd like to just clarify at the outset, I think we're running behind schedule. Are any of the organizers around? Would it be okay to go 10-15 minutes over time if need be?
I'll speak for the Lanre.
Yeah, is that okay? Okay.
It's only 10 or 15.
Okay, 10 or 15, thank you very much. Well, the scene has been fairly extensively set, I would say. Time-wise, it's interesting for us to be having this next panel discussion, business and the new development framework on this day, because as we've heard, the high-level panel has its first meeting today. And discussions that are carried out there and the wider consultation process are, of course, going to be a fundamental part of what replaces the Millennium Development Goals. I'd like to structure the discussion as follows. Maybe sort of to just sort of contextualize it, I would suggest that a greater role for business in defining whatever happens next is almost inevitable. All of us here are aware that we live in very different times, and we live in times of quite rapid and quite unprecedented change. The world of 2012 bears very little resemblance to the world of 2000, both in terms of thinking about development, practice in development, and of course the realities in which development takes place. We've seen all sorts of shifts, all sorts of changes and realignments. One of those that I'd like to hone in on to sort of to contextualize this discussion is the move away from an over-reliance on aid and handouts as the driver of development. When you go to those regions that need it the most these days, like sub-Saharan Africa, and you ask people, what drives development, a common refrain is we need trade, not aid. When you look at the development community today, it seems that that recognition is creeping into how these organizations work. DFID, the UK's development body, for example, now has sort of as its de facto tagline the idea that the private sector is the engine of growth, which marks quite an interesting departure from previous thinking. And it seems that these days any self-respecting development body has a dedicated private sector department. So I would suggest that there's an inevitability to this. The question is no longer, does business get involved? The only question seems to be, how exactly do you define this relationship? At the same time, there's still a remarkable divergence between the way business thinks and the way the development community thinks. In my line of work, we sort of engage with policymakers, development practitioners, and businesses, and I'm always struck by just how different people still see things. And I'd like to have that as sort of the central theme for this debate, which is, how do you get these very different types of people onto the same page? Because the question is how. And for me, one of the central issues there is, well, first of all, how do you get people to understand what the priorities are? And how do you build some level of consensus and avoid a situation in which people are effectively talking past each other? I'm joined by an excellent panel of experts who know infinitely more about this than I do, and I'm going to sort of turn to them in a minute. Let me just very briefly introduce them. Their full biographies are in the program. I'll start to the far left. We have Deborah, is it Dugan? Dugan. Deborah Dugan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of RED. Next to her, we have Jane Nelson, who is Senior Fellow and Director of Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative at the Mossa Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. There we go. I'm surprised there's space for anyone else on it.
I didn't provide that title.
Then to my immediate left, we have Chris Johnson, who is Director of Private Sector at Oxfam America. To my right, we have Luigi Sampaolo, who is the Vice President for Sustainability, Stakeholder Engagement and Community Relations at ENI. And John Fallon has, of course, been introduced. John, we're going to give you a break for now. And let you catch your breath. And I'm going to start by asking the panel one question. And I'd like each of the panelists to spend maybe just 2 or 3 minutes giving us their perspective on this question to get the discussion going, and then we'll take it from there. And that question is very simple. I'd like us to have a sort of very brief review of the MDGs, and I mean very brief, so about 3 minutes or so, but with one central theme in mind, which is from a business perspective and looking at where the world is now compared to where it was in 2000 and the experience of the MDGs, what was their biggest weakness when it came to not doing enough to provide a framework through which the business community and the private sector could have a meaningful say in this thing called development and driving this process of development? And I think we'll just go from left to right on that. I'll start with you.
Great. Well, it's interesting. I imagine that most of you in the room know about Product Red and how Bono and Bonnie Shriver got together in 2006 as a response to a crisis to say that the Global Fund wasn't getting any or hardly any private sector involvement at a time when countries and everybody were coming to the table. And so what was the model to incentivize them? Basically what I do just about all day, every day, which is probably different from other people in this room, is to go into companies and try to get them involved in one particular UN Millennium Development Goal and to have them see it through to the end, to 2015, and to raise money. So RED to date has raised $196 million for the Global Fund from a variety of partners. So we have Starbucks, we have Coca-Cola, we have SAP, maybe not the usual suspects, Converse, Beats, Belvedere Vodka. How do you get the unusual suspects to care about these issues and to come to the table? So when I came into RED, there was definitely a feeling that AIDS was unbeatable. There was partner fatigue. Some that had been in it from the beginning said, we're not seeing momentum, we're not seeing progress. It was the UN Millennium Goal of eliminating mother-child transmission by this date that had had enough quantifiable evidence that it was progressing that I could show from 1,000 mothers a day transmitting HIV to their babies down to 900. It could be virtually zero by 2015. Come, join this crusade. I was able to rally people that otherwise I don't think would know about the issue, would rally. So thank goodness there are these goals. I don't think people know about them enough. And I think it's quite important if you have the opportunity to bring the business sector in early, rather than, as Lee said, a little too late in the game, but then they did rally at the right time. I think that right now is a confluence of three very important things that are happening. One is the state of technology. So with social media, I just came from the Mashable Summit of using social media for social good. People can get involved, companies can get involved in ways that didn't exist before. And the knowledge base and the communication is nothing compared to, of course, what it was when the goals were started out. The other thing is this generation is quite active and wants to get involved. And it is an imperative to show businesses that their constituents, their customers, their employees care about these issues. And so you now have a generation where 71% of 20 to 35-year-olds has raised money for a cause. 81% in the Cone report go to companies that believe they have a responsibility to address social issues. 94% of consumers worldwide will switch a brand to go to one that supports a cause. 93% would boycott a company for irresponsibility, and 56% have already done that. And 88% says it's okay if you're not perfect, if you don't reach things, but you try and you're transparent about your efforts. So at the same time that you have technology being in a place where we can get so many involved and actually make these goals popular and let people know they exist, you have youth that wants to really participate, and then you have corporations that actually have to participate. So I think you'd be leaving a lot on the table if you didn't do it drastically different this time.
Great, thank you. We spoke earlier about the need to make the next set of goals more popular and to make sure people actually know about them, which is an interesting deficiency in the MDGs. Jane, your thoughts about what some of the biggest flaws or maybe just weaknesses of the MDGs were when it came to bringing the private sector?
Great. Now, I want to sort of start actually with, I think, one of their strengths, although they didn't use that strength to harness the private sector, and that was the fact that they were, for the first time ever, quantifiable, time-bound goals, targets, and indicators, which the business community can relate to, but wasn't involved in the setting and the discussion, let alone involving the general public more widely. And so I think sort of going forward, it seems to me there's sort of three key elements of involving the business sector. One is including business voices in the framing, and as you say, it's going to be impossible not to. And I think it's not only a question of including them in the formal process, and we do have Paul Pullman from Unilever and Betty Kanya from the Kenya Association of Manufacturers on the high-level panel, so that's great. But I think picking up on Deborah's point, how does one use media platforms, how does one engage with the business coalitions, the Global Coalition on Health, the Business Coalition Against Trafficking, which has just been launched in the last few days, and the CO Water Mandate, sort of collective business coalitions, and tap into them to really sort of, I think, include the collective ideas of business in a far more creative way than we've done before. So I think that's the first thing, sort of including business much more in the shaping of them. Secondly, I think where the MDGs fell down, and we could do better next time, is being much more explicit in the role of business and giving better guidance on what business could do. So if you sort of take each of the 8 goals, and if each of them had under education, here's what business can do, here's what civil society can do, and sort of more explicit, while still enabling enough flexibility for individual sectors to do things in a different way. I think business would have been more engaged, and the fact that the pharmaceutical sector was called on, it gave the Oxfams and some of the other campaigns that sort of opportunity to challenge the pharmaceutical sector, and by and large they responded. But we've got mining companies in the room here and energy companies that also had a big role in tackling HIV/AIDS, the RED campaign, and so there was the idea that it was just the pharmaceutical companies that would tackle health. And so I think they can be a lot more creative in saying all companies can tackle education, all companies can tackle health, regardless of the industry sector. To a similar extent, food security is not just the agribusiness companies, it's retailers, it's transportation companies, it's media companies, etc. So I think, first of all, better inclusion of business in the shaping of them. Second, sort of a more explicit guidance and call to action to business around specific goals. And then thirdly, I don't think the Millennium Development Goals focused enough on the sort of the country level action. I mean, obviously each country had adopted the Millennium Development Goals, and 189 countries signed up to them. But there was not enough about the structures at the country level. And I think next time round, could part of the commitment be that each country sets up a platform that is business, civil society, academics, as well as government, to sort of shape a national development agenda. Could each country sign up to one of the big outcomes, I think, for me from Rio+20 was the whole thing of natural capital accounting and putting natural capital and pricing into national GDP accounts. And maybe that's too ambitious, but could one sort of think of more action at the country level which explicitly engages business as well as civil society in addressing them at the country level? So sort of more inclusive in the shaping, better guidance and call to action in whatever the goals are that we come up with, and then the One campaigns and the Oxfams and others can challenge and cooperate with business more directly, and then more action at the country level.
Great. Chris, you're in charge of the private sector at Oxfam. Now, once mortal enemies, We find NGOs working hand in hand with business. Times have very much changed, and I guess now's the time to have that reflected in whatever comes after the MDGs. What are your thoughts on what they got wrong and what they need to improve on?
Thanks, Lamry, and I will comment on that. Lamry said at the beginning that no self-respecting development group would not have a private sector department, but then you asked me, you were surprised that Oxfam had one. I don't know what to make of that, but I'll move on from there. We do have a private sector department.
I'm a bit old-fashioned when it comes to NGOs.
Yeah. Oxfam has engaged the private sector for many years, and it's true that a lot of the engagement originally was adversarial, and I think alongside many other development actors, we've recognized that the private sector really has to be part of the solution, and we've adopted an approach to the private sector that includes both adversarialness when it's called for, but an open door to collaborations and partnering. And I think, well, I was going to say also that it's always tricky being on a panel with Jane because she leaves so little to be said afterwards, and now I have Deborah to compete with also, so I don't have that much more on this question, but I do think the MDGs can't really be blamed for their weaknesses because, as you also suggested at the beginning, the world has really changed, and there really wasn't much of a robust dialogue between the business community and the development community back in those days, and there was sort of a statist view of development, very much dependent on the public sector. Today we know better, and I think the next round will incorporate the private sector in a much more sophisticated way for all the reasons that Deborah and Jane mentioned. And I will say that having just been through many years of working with John Ruggie on his mandate, I think he did it very well in the sense that he very explicitly carved out the role for the state and then did the same for the private sector to make sure that nobody could misunderstand that there is a differentiated but important role for both in any kind of agreement. And I would hope that the MDGs could take that approach. I'll say one other thing, just to put it out there. From the NGO side, this is a little bit of a tricky discussion for us because we love the MDGs, Oxfam that is, and we still think there's a lot of good work that has to be done, and we hope that this conversation won't neglect the last couple of years of moving the MDGs along. But we are always a little cautious about the role of business moving into a space like this, a space that is traditionally occupied by states and the UN with all their problems, but then you bring the private sector in. And the reason that we're concerned is, I'll just lay out 3 quick reasons. One is, there's always the concern that this is really just a marketing exercise for companies, and that companies are basically doing this anyway, and now they can put an overlay of MDGs on their work, and suddenly they get that halo without having done anything different. So there's always a question in our minds from the NGO side is, how did you actually change your business because of the existence of these MDGs? How did that actually change a fundamental decision at the business level? And listening to a lot of the discussion earlier today, and I think all of the inclusive business discussion is wonderful, I always have that in my mind. And I think one person even said it, we never even knew we were doing inclusive business until someone came and told us, and that's great. Now we can say we're doing inclusive business as well. So there is always that concern. Is it marketing, is it greenwash, or is it substantive? Secondly, there's a question of whether the business community coming in is an excuse for the state to go out. And so, you've heard Obama with his new alliance, and the World Economic Forum has their new vision, and that's great. We're bringing in the private sector. But the first thing the NGOs will always say is, let's not forget that the public sector has made certain commitments, and you can't balance those 2 things out. This has to be additive, right? And then the final one is that the business sector being so powerful and so well organized, or at least that's our image of the business sector from the outside, you know better from the inside, we always worry that you're going to run circles around everybody else at the table and that the business sector is going to dominate the agenda. And suddenly it's not going to be a pro-poor agenda. It's going to be a business-friendly and secondarily pro-poor agenda. And so there's always that concern as well. And I hope that the conversation can touch on some of those concerns today as well.
More often than not finds itself in the firing line when it comes to accusations of not paying enough attention to social needs and social impact and so on and so forth. As we sort of zero in on 2015, would you, as Jane has suggested, like a little bit more guidance as to what a company like ENI should be doing? Is that something that you look forward to?
Yeah, of course, I don't know if I can be accused of greenwashing in what I'm going to say now, but for sure we stay in countries for decades, and we are looking for projects that can allow us to participate in the local development, and we do that for a strategy, of course. The strategy that is due to the fact that if we want to operate in a country, we need a sort of license to operate from society. So, and to align our action to what are the country needs is for us something that is business strategies. Of course, a clear framework can help us in build projects that meet the needs of the people who host us. And this is not just a general speech. We can be also concrete. In several cases, the Millennium Development Goals were adopted at a country level. And so the government, local government, has designed an intervention that was built on MDGs. And then when we wanted to do something for the local development, we had a precise framework from which to start. And this is, for example, a project I have in mind is in Republic of Congo, is an integrated development project where several MDGs are part of this project. So if we have a clear framework in which to operate, for us, it's much easier to do something that is not based on greenwashing or something else, but in concrete needs.
Mm-hmm. John, and maybe Luigi as well, I'd like to put to you something that, which is that is always a bit of suspicion that a company, especially a big company, will use things like the MDGs as a nice marketing exercise, a great way to position yourselves in PR terms. Now, I don't expect you to agree with that, but I'm just curious. There's implicit in that is a more fundamental question, which is how does a business integrate the questions of sustainability, questions of development into what a business does at its core, rather than something that is considered CSR, something we do on the side, to getting to a point where actually this is kind of part of what we do, and our bottom line it takes this into consideration. Is that a realistic aspiration?
I may be naive, but I don't just believe it's a realistic aspiration. I believe it's what all good companies do. I think this idea of, there's the business purpose and the social purpose is another of these false dichotomies. For any good business, for there to be a good business, there has to be a social need that has been met and has been met well, in my view. That would be my view. There's one thing I did want to pick up, this thing about displacing the state, because I do sort of completely understand that, and I've been in a number of debates where you feel like you've touched the third rail when you get into this sort of public or private. But I was interested in is there a circumstance in which Oxfam could see that the private displacing the public, and the private displacing the public may not be a global corporation, it may be a local entrepreneur, where the private does it better than the public. And very specifically education, I think one of the huge frustrations across Africa is not actually now lack of, not always, there are new schools, there are new textbooks, there's lots of money going in, and nothing changes in the learning outcomes. So in those circumstances, the private could be displacing the public, and it could result in a public good rather than being just displacement. Does that? I mean, that was sort of a perspective that I'd be interested in.
Well, I think that it's a good question, and the way I was using displacement there was more about in terms of overall investment from the state versus...
I would completely agree with that.
Versus the privatization question, which you raise, and that's always a tricky one for NGOs because we recognize that the state doesn't always do it well, and that oftentimes the private sector can do it better. But I think our concern is that where you don't have a functioning state, or not a well-functioning state with a strong regulatory capacity, when the private sector moves in, they're often, there's no accountability for how they go about it. So it could well lead to better benefits, but it could also lead to worse. And so Oxfam would probably sit somewhere as being skeptically open to it.
Right, okay.
Right, on that
point about it just being a marketing sort of campaign, it would be interesting to sort of unpick that a bit, because I think there's a difference between something that's a marketing and even public relations and sort of communications campaign and something that's greenwash and not serious. So I'm assuming it's sort of the greenwash sort of question you're more concerned about. But if a company can demonstrate that they're either mainstreaming a particular development solution or problem through their mainstream business options, or as the Red campaign is doing, actually using marketing capability to raise awareness and in their case sort of raise funds to address a particular challenge, that would be encouraged, or you're uncomfortable with marketing? Well, that's surely one of the greatest assets a company has.
Yes.
Business and consumer goods companies have is their ability to engage with the general public and use their marketing power.
Yeah, Chris, I think Deborah, you look like you're dying to get in.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think marketing is part of the substance. I think, I'm just going to give my own example, but I was at Walt Disney Company for 8 years, came and took the job at Red, saw that there was optimism and a positive UN Millennium Goal that would get companies and the consumers so interested if they only knew that this actually could be done, that there was something positive going on, and that companies spend millions of dollars out of a pool that is billions on perhaps letting people know. I mean, I received an email that said that I was somebody on the policy side, that the UN had just reached their Millennium Goal that 1/2 of the people on the planet had access to clean water. And I was in my office going, what is wrong that not everybody in the world knows this? What is wrong that we go to the streets and we protest, but we don't go out and all clap hands and say, ding, that goal was reached? So if we could use companies' marketing dollars, what I tend to do is look at businesses in a portfolio of what they bring to the table. Some bring money, some bring consumer awareness, some have special knowledge and expertise. So if you look at Coca-Cola, they are contributing to the Global Fund. They are helping with awareness campaigns to let youth know about the issues and have people still care about AIDS. Then they are looking in Tanzania about the distribution for the Global Fund and how they could do it better and get pills to people faster. Home run. And to your point, our fear is that business will take over or be too broad in this involvement. I don't know, to me it seems like it's so small in the picture and there's so much more that could be done than in this age of transparency, calling people out, saying, yeah, you're marketing, but what else are you doing? Or guess what, that's not authentic. That's not the DNA of your company. What you seem to be about is this. That will come from people keeping track. I was just at the Unilever site, and they have dots of like what they've done, what they've accomplished, where they made mistakes. This isn't working. That's what people want now. And so we're at a day and age, and there's a fabulous paper that came out by one organization this week that says, what if people voted for what these goals should be? What if there was some way, because we're saying, okay, how do you involve companies? Well, companies really care about what their customers care about, just like a senator in Ohio cares about, does their constituency care about foreign aid? So it is the same thing. If you could show a level of buy-in that people in some way know about these goals, and the poorest people could say, this is what is more important to me, whether it's agriculture, education, corruption. I don't pretend to know the answer, but we actually have the technology through cell phones, through texting, that there could be a campaign. So as far as marketing, I say bring it on.
Okay.
As long as there's substance underneath it.
I'd like to pick up specifically on something that we've already touched on quite a bit, which is, while we might agree that, yes, business has to, by all means, be more involved in this, clearly there's a very important question of where you draw the lines, and the lines need to be quite fine. We've already heard of issues of, we don't want private sector sort of, crowding out the public sector, absolving the public sector of responsibility, but we're also talking here about very sensitive issues, and issues that aren't necessarily, regardless of how pro-business one might be, the remit of the business community. Where do we draw that line? So for example, do we go as far as saying, we now want a set of goals, measurable goals for a business, i.e., so in 10 years, Shell or Chevron, you need to build this X amount of schools, or you need to educate X amount of people. Is anybody realistically going to sign up to that? Or is it more consultation and sort of, maybe light touch regulation if you want? Maybe we'll start with you, Jane, and then get some input from the private sector here.
I don't think one wants sort of prescriptive, Chevron or XYZ company, you're going to build X amount of schools. I think, but I do think, and we're moving in that direction of companies having to be more transparent and accountable, just reporting on their sustainability performance, and that you're seeing stock exchanges requiring that as a requirement of listing increasingly. So I think the idea of going forward on sort of mandatory reporting on sort of environmental, social performance is probably one way to do it, but not saying you have to build 6 schools, or you have to make sure that your greenhouse gas emissions are only at a certain level, but you have to report on those things. And then what's going to be material to an energy company is going to be very different to what's material to a financial company. But just the requirement of being transparent about one's sort of broader societal performance, I think is the way to do that. To achieve that. I think another thing, and Chris might want to comment on this, I think we are seeing more indices emerging, and Oxfam's working on one at the moment. So the Access to Medicines Index, the Nutrition Index that the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition is developing, FTSE for Good, Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So sort of like a competitive element where external parties are judging the performance of business, but more on a competitive basis rather than a prescriptive basis. Okay. So I think those would be 2 ways, to guide. I think coming back to the government business thing, to me, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative has all sorts of challenges, but I think that's a really interesting model, which actually sort of talks about dual responsibility of both government being more transparent and, in this case, mining and energy companies being more transparent. And that, so there might be opportunities for more frameworks like that in other industry sectors, but that's much more about managing the risks and not having a negative impact, versus the sort of creating shared value.
Luigi, I'd like to bring you in on this one, on this relationship between business and sort of public bodies. Where does the line need to be drawn so that sustainability and development is relevant and kind of in line with what you do as a business, but doesn't get in the way of the bottom line?
Well, first of all, I can speak just about energy sector and oil and gas. So I think it's very different from other sectors. For example, states are our partner, and in joint venture where they have the majority very often of the shares. So we don't want the state to go out. And sometimes we want the states to invest more with us in certain projects. So that there is this part of the public sector, and then there is, of course, another part that is the part who identify the priorities for example, for the development policy. And of course, this is a line that we don't have to cross. But after that, if priority are well defined by the politics, I think we can do a lot to realize it. For example, in the case of sustainable energy for all, that is something missing in the first set of the development goals, and that now is well recognized that it's needed that there will be explicitly considered in the new set of goals. Of course, that is a field where energy companies can do a lot, but the priority must be defined by the political framework. Then we can realize maybe a power plant, and maybe someone else, not another private actor, can maybe build the grid, and then another actor. So we need a lot of different actors to realize the goals of sustainable energy for all. And of course, the governments are the one who have to set the priorities.
I think the next iteration of Millennium Development Goals, sort of in terms of education, need to be much more sort of outcome focused, and it stands to reason that therefore business should be held to the same regard. But I would hold them to an outcome that relates to what their core business is. So if you're an energy company, and therefore I would imagine your social purpose, which is also your business purpose, is to provide the energy that is going to power the economic growth of Africa over the next decade in a sustainable, cheap, accessible way, then that's what should be measured. And I think we're in an era of redefining what the public company is. Because if you think public companies are essentially owned by the public, they're owned by pretty much every major pension fund around the world, and we talk about profit, but what public companies do with profit is one of three things. They pay dividends to shareholders, which will be pretty much everybody in this room and every global community around the world. They pay taxes to national governments, and what's left when they pay profits and taxes, they reinvest in whatever the core purpose is. And so I think it's that public companies need to be more confident in that and much clearer to hold themselves to account in that. And I think that's where I think we need to go.
Chris or Deborah, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's mutual accountability that works, because when I look at the policy considerations and then I look at the private sector considerations, there's more that overlaps that if you blew out in looking at these new goals rather than all the differences. So the people in this room, have very clear, all I keep hearing is, measurable timeline, everything transparent, deliverables, outcomes. Of course, that's the same mentality of a company. And so if these goals were put together more like a strategic plan that said, there's these big targets, these big outcomes, there's these actions, it's this timeline, we need these strategic partners to make it happen. We're going to show you at this point along the way that we're here. You do this. I mean, it's sort of an interdependent outcome, but I think it's the right way to speak the same language and get incredible buy-in and everybody very clear on what the roles are. At the same time, what the rewards are. So I don't think it's so bad that when a company shows up and does its stuff that it results in more business for them, because the consumer knows that, improves their image, they have more employee loyalty, their CEO comes from a leader to maybe creating a legacy. These are important things to companies. And by being involved in the Millennium Goals, I actually think that there's a confluence that they could come together in a much, much bigger way than 15 years ago.
So just to pick up on a couple of those things. First, I want to clarify, when I suggested that there's a concern about business being at the table, it wasn't to say that business shouldn't be at the table. It's just that the way business comes to the table and the conditions are important to groups like Oxfam. But of course, we want business at the table, and we believe in the private sector. Or the role of the private sector. But I think what John said was probably where we would come out also with one exception, which is, we want to see the Millennium Development Goals address the core business, what is core to business to do. But I would say there's another element that's really important, and this gets to how an Oxfam views development. For us, poverty is not really about an absence of stuff or resources or money flows. It's really about questions of power and marginalization and the capacity to access that stuff, because many countries have plenty of food, even the poorest countries, but you have just as many people that aren't able to access it because of discriminatory laws or cultures. And so my question would be, what's the role of business in helping to address some of those fundamental drivers of poverty? Because the discussion is almost always about how does business address the question of resources, more products to be sold to the poor, more money to be invested, even jobs, which is great, but it doesn't necessarily address that other fundamental piece of the development puzzle. And I think there is a role there for the businesses, and a lot of it has to do with their political influence. And I'll give you one example here. In Africa, we know that over the next 10 years or so, $1 trillion is going to be pulled out of the ground in terms of oil and minerals. $1 trillion. Now, traditionally, that money would not serve the poor, and it would probably even worsen the situation of the poor because it breeds corruption and inequality and all these other things. And so if I'm an oil or mining company, I can do a lot with my supply chain, I can do a lot with my CSR programs, but if I'm not addressing that fundamental question of who's going to capture that wealth and how is that going to be divvied up within the society. And here I think the oil community and the mining community have largely fallen down because a year ago when the Dodd-Frank law was passed and there was a provision in there for transparency around extractive industries, only one mining company would step up to support that, Newmont. All the others were aggressively or on the sidelines or aggressively ready to push it back against it. And so the question is, if I'm really concerned about the MDGs as an Exxon or a Chevron, should I not be promoting extractive industries transparency, which is going to be the most fundamental thing I can do probably as a company to help address corruption, criminality, inequality, all these other things. And that, I think, is where the rubber hits the road. So I'll tie it off with this final question of greenwash and marketing. There's two issues there. Yes, I think it's a little bit cheeky for companies to not really do anything different and then say, but we are doing inclusive business. So but that's not really the concern. I think there's also a question of what happens, and I don't mean to pick on Exxon, but they're just so easy. What happens if Exxon is doing a lot of problematic things in a country, but contributes to REDD, or does something nice on the CSR side? Is an Oxfam going to cheer that when we know that the business model in a particular country might be quite damaging to the local population, but they are doing something over here that maybe compensates for 5 or 10%. I don't think an Oxfam or an NGO or a civil society will ever get behind that, and we would consider that greenwash if Exxon were trumpeting those kinds of smaller issues and not addressing the big core business impacts, right? And so that's where our greenwash concern comes out, and it's a very tricky issue because we want to celebrate the good work that companies do, but we want to make sure that it's really a core part of their whole realm of impacts, right?
Can I pick up very quickly two very quick points on there? The first on the point about corruption. I think, from my own personal experiences, there are now countries in the world where we do not engage with the public sector and are pursuing a purely private, direct-to-consumer education approach, precisely because of the issues of corruption and the like, which is, I think, is a huge challenge. And secondly, I think you are onto something where I do think public companies do have to think hard is around pay, their approach to the living wage and the like. And I think that's something where the global big business, for want of a better word, could work together more effectively, learn from each other and all sort of work together so there's no sort of competitive edge or whatever. But I think that issue about living wage and the like is, I think, a huge one, and it's the one that, because I think it's this executive pay is the one that really probably damages big business more than any other single issue, and I think it is an issue of equity, and it is one we have to look at. I'd agree with that.
Yeah. No, and I would just add on the influencing policy, I think it does make a difference that the CEOs of these major companies have confidence in the global fund, have vetted it, and have put, Apple over $50 million, and that actually then does influence policy when people see them at Capitol Hill.
I also want to come back to this question of sustainability or corporate responsibility reporting. I think if companies are required to materially identify what are the risks, the social, environmental, human rights risks that are most material to their company and their business, what are the social, environmental development opportunities that are most material, and report on those, and also demonstrate that they've got due diligence mechanisms in place to address them. then I think it overcomes that challenge. But I absolutely agree with you. If one company's doing a marketing campaign and then their core business is not aligned or is actually having a negative impact, then that's problematic. But I do think this thing of broader reporting on these issues and the demonstration of due diligence mechanisms is probably one of our best hopes of getting a more level playing field and getting companies more engaged without being prescriptive on what each company has to do specifically.
Thanks. We're going to get to the Q&A in a bit, but I want to drop in a couple of more questions. One is, and this has come out as well, that we talk about business, but of course business is a very, very varied term. There are so many businesses doing so many things in so many different sectors. And not everywhere is it obvious what development means for you. Not everywhere is it obvious how you integrate this question of development into what you do. Which raises the other question, well, how does business fit into the consultation process and the process of formulating these new goals? Is it every business for every man for himself, or do we sort of envisage the community getting together in some form, or way, shape, or form, and having a spokesperson, as it were, to sort of communicate the needs and desires of business when it comes to development? Jane, you look like you're very keen to pick up on that.
She's always keen.
Feigning interest.
Well, I'll start, but I think there's obviously business representative organisations. We have them in the room, the International Chamber of Commerce, so, who will, I'm sure, give input. I think there's enormous potential for sector-based and the leadership sector-based, the International Council of Mining and Metals, the CEO water mandate, etc. So I think there's the UN Principles on Responsible Investment and the sort of investor community. So I think having some sort of sector-based input is potentially important. And then there is a discussion about doing these consultations in at least 50 countries. And I think at the country level, coming back to an earlier point I made, there's an opportunity there to bring in your domestic companies, smaller and medium-sized companies. The challenges, will they come to the table? And so I think they need to be encouraged and invited to say, well, what's going to matter for Mozambique or for Papua New Guinea, not just sort of broad global agenda.
Is anyone else on that one, or?
Well, I just think it has to derive from what needs to be done, so that if it's on finance, technology, who can come in on agriculture, on supply chain, on environment, it has to come from the bottom up, and then you approach the companies, I think, to play ball.
Yes.
No, of course, we are participating as a Global Compact lead company in the process. And I think that one is one tool that will be very useful for the business to participate in the debate for post-2015.
Now, I'd like to have a look at the high-level panel. It's got one CEO on it, which is not much, of quite a few names. Yes, there's an industry representative as well. Is there, ironically, a risk here that this is a bit of a marketing exercise for the development community? They kind of understand, yes, we need the business community in here, stick a CEO on the panel, and keep them happy. I'm not sure if it's a valid question to ask, but how confident can the business community be that the will is really there to give them a meaningful voice in formulating these goals? Chris, let's start with you.
We don't engage in those kind of PR exercises. No, I'm kidding. I would have a hard time commenting, to be honest, because I have not had any engagement. So I don't know what the motives of the development community are, or in this case, the donor community, in bringing in just one very progressive CEO. But I would, from the business side, I'd say it's a little too early to be skeptical. We're just starting out this, starting this out, and getting one at the table, an important one, and then gradually building up, I think, is probably a perfectly legitimate approach, but others may feel differently.
Yeah. I agree, and I think having Betty Kanya on the panel as well, representing a country level manufacturers association, it is a start, but it's 2 out of I think a panel of 27, and so
would you say there kind of needs to be more on there? as this
there
continues?
needs to, I mean, there probably need to be more NGOs,
Yeah.
and I haven't looked at the panel and careful, so there's some academics on the panel. I'm not sure there actually are any development NGOs represented on the panel. So I think they're going to, I mean, the panel is it's obviously going to be critically important, but I think we're going to need other platforms, to ensure that there's a broader voice.
Sure. If nobody else wants to come in on this, we'll go to the audience.
Hi, I'm Eriko Ishikawa from the International Finance Corporation from the Inclusive Business Models Group. I think it was a very interesting panel because you have hit on the points of so many of the issues that we from the development community who also finance private sector encounter. When the first Millennium Development Goals came out, I was such a avid, like, okay, now we're going to help our companies meet these goals. And then I opened it up. Number one is about absolute poverty. It's $1.25 a day. How many private sector companies can really reach people at $1.25 a day? Very few. Maybe in infrastructure, water. There are some companies that are privatized that we work with that can reach slums. But $1.25 a day, PPP, for the private sector. And I know this because Jane and I worked on a publication from Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola wanted to be able to say, yes, we really do this number one. I had to turn around and say, you know what? You do the one with women much better than you can say about poverty because you haven't measured the before and the after. They had people who were very poor that they were employed in the manual distribution system, but they'd never bothered to measure what were they making before they started working there. And this is what private sector does not go out and measure baselines. Really. I have had to deal with a lot of private sector companies, and I say, okay, what did they used to make before? You're telling me they're making, 10 cents more, 20 cents more. Did you measure what they made more? So it is really tough for a private sector company to have baselines. They never heard of them. So there are ways in which the MDGs could be adapted, like Jane said, by sector, by country, or it could be something that they can maybe achieve. So it is a real difficulty. And I wanted to also say that I agree totally about having to be core business before you can believe that it is inclusive business. That is really, really important. In your own core business, what can you do? In your own value chain, what can you do? And I was the one who made the comment that we have about 300 companies that we have actually looked at their business models and we can say they are inclusive. Most of them are local companies. There are only a very few that are global companies, but they're in agribusiness. So in the local place, they have supply chains that are local. And we can vouch for that. So we're not talking, IFC does not lend to that many large multinational companies in that sector of agribusiness, and these are things. We do have a whole different program with extractive industries, but the 300 that we're talking about, 99% are local businesses. So that's why when I said they didn't even know they were doing an inclusive business, it's because they may not even know that Business Call to Action is looking for companies that are doing interesting projects. They do it because it's part of what they do. And we're the ones who go and say, I want to write a case study, and they go, oh my God, IFC again asking for information. But we can say that because we lend money or we invest in them, we know that they're financially, socially, and environmentally meeting certain standards. And that's the core of the inclusive business, to do whatever you can in your own core business. So what is done as social responsibility, what is done as charity through foundations is commendable, but I do agree with, with the fact that it is marketing. And marketing is fine. I agree that you do have to have companies that are really socially invested in doing things that they believe in. But when we talk about inclusive business model, it has to be the business model. And if we're going to influence them, we've got to come out with MDGs that they can understand. I think that would be, yeah. So if any one of you can address the issue, how can you break it down more easily for companies to really be able to embrace it, not just as a PR exercise, but as part of their core business?
Great, thank you.
This might be a slightly different perspective on it, but your point about engaging with people who really are living on $1.25 a day, We have, in Pearson, we've recently set up a fund to focus specifically on supporting private education entrepreneurs. We somewhat crudely call it edupreneurs. These are people who operate in private schools around the world, and this is a phenomenon that exists. And they will be charging parents $1 a week, okay? In our language schools so that's what, $30 a year. Our language schools in China or universities in South Africa would be charging $3,000, $4,000 a year. The challenge that has posed in Pearson to start to think about what's it like to design a business, an offering that is effective, so it's been true to what I said before about enhancing learning outcomes, and is at least self-sustaining and preferably profitable. It's been an incredible learning experience for everybody in the company, because you have to have a completely different mindset. And that's what, I think that's what C.K. Prahalad was talking about. You can't you have to completely reinvent it. So I don't have I wouldn't say I've got an answer from any of it, other than to say I think it's an incredibly powerful way. And I think we've learned a huge amount of other things, that the company has been enriched in other ways by the process of doing it. But obviously that's no good. What we've got to do is find an answer that then helps the people that we set out to help in the first place. But it's an interesting dynamic, I think, for many global companies.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, just that it needs to be authentic and not too burdensome, the ask, because this, like you're saying, you know so much about language learning in Asia to know that it's not that much. I know nothing about Pearson's number, but it's not going to be that much skin off your back if because it's your knowledge base and you know it. And that's the same way with distribution with Coca-Cola, and it's the same way with procurement with Avon. It's the same way with J&J and health, different services that they do. So when it's intrinsic in the business, that's why I feel like it has to come from the goals first, to say what do we need to get this done, and then go to those special areas of expertise. When I meet with the head of the Global Fund, that's what I say all the time. I say, what's going to help you get this done? And he says, we need, I'm making it up, condoms. We need, procurement or whatever. And those are the companies I try to go to get involved. And then I show them the whole picture and how it's good for them, people care about it, and it actually moves the needle in a huge way.
Yeah, Chris?
Very quickly. I think that the issue of how do we get companies engaged with people living on a $1.25 a day is a fundamental challenge, but only if we see this very narrowly. And I agree that that's where we're going to tend to see this, but it would narrowly be about what can we sell to a person earning $1.25 a day, and that most companies are not going to meet that standard. That's true. But if we, again, try to move beyond and I think Prahalad says it nicely, moving from victims to customers is good, but how about moving from victims to customers to then citizens, right?
Yeah.
And that's the whole development quagmire. How do we actually engage the rest of the population that has no voice in development? And there again, I think companies touch citizens in all kinds of ways that we don't consider to be part of an inclusive business model. So company marketing touches them. The company relationships with governments touches them. The company involvement in these sorts of initiatives. And I would just say on that, there's one example that has stuck with me. When we worked with Coca-Cola in El Salvador, and Coca-Cola had trouble years before that, in 2003 or 2004, Human Rights Watch had written a report about child labor in the sugar plantations in El Salvador. And Coca-Cola was the biggest purchaser of sugar, but they said, we buy, I think, somewhere between 4 to 8% of this. It's 3 tiers down. We have absolutely no way of influencing this. And the brand risk was so high that Coca-Cola found a way to influence it. They went and got together with the ILO and the government, and they largely solved that. Not solved it, but they certainly addressed that problem. I think if companies see a long-term interest in stable societies that goes beyond the short-term interest in making that immediate money, if they start seeing that, then we can talk about these larger development issues. But until companies can be made to see that they're going to be around for 5 or 10 or 15 years in a country, and they could actually influence the development trajectory of that country to their long-term interest, then they might start thinking about some of these broader development issues, hopefully.
Yeah. which I think goes back to a point you raised earlier about the sort of the languages and the mindsets being different. And so I think there is a sort of an education process needed. We always talk about the business case, and at one level we think the business case has been made, and I'm not sure it has been made enough. And to me, there are at least sort of, 3 elements of it. One is, and you mentioned earlier, you're sort of managing your risks and your sort of social license to operate, which is, primarily around, the do no harm and, minimize negative impacts. And sort of having, enough clarity on what are the risks if you don't get that right. Secondly, what are the business opportunities, whether it's including smallholder farmers or sort of serving low-income markets, or marketing opportunities, or sort of the sort of business opportunities to create shared value. But then I think Chris has a really important point, that there's that third level about just improving the long-term enabling environment for business and private sector development that actually requires greater statesmanship on the part of business. And Paul Polman's name's been mentioned several times in our panel, but listening to him speak at the Rio Plus 20 conference, and sort of challenging his fellow business people to do more with government on sort of public policy issues, and you find, I think, more and more business leaders doing that, and or things like the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is, I think, now the top 20 or sort of 25 or so mining companies, coming together and saying, okay, we're the leaders in the industry, we will all sign up to a sort of sustainable development set of standards, and then hold ourselves accountable, and then you hopefully bring more along with you, which is much more about that broader sort of enabling environment role than the immediate company level risk management or creating new business opportunities. And I think we sort of muddle those 3 motivations up, but I think those sort of 3 elements of the business case you can probably make for each of the current Millennium Development Goals, and for each industry sector, and we need to be more explicit about that.
Great, thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yeah, there's a lady front here, and there's a lady back there as well.
I'm Nancy Wildfire Field. I've recently joined BSR, and recently have also been working with the U.S. Agency for International Development in the field. So I'm going to pose some questions and some thoughts kind of from both perspectives. And Jane, to your point, you've brought to the surface that theoretically the business case has been made, but the question is it? Or has it been? And we're talking to a lot of leadership companies here, but what about the next tier? What about those that we haven't been engaging yet, or who don't really see the business case yet? How do we begin to engage them in this dialogue moving forward? What about some of the tensions between headquarters and operations? And leadership gets it in some cases. In other cases, regional operations get it. But there's a disconnect here. So how do we begin to close some of that bridge as part of this dialogue? The third area is around national companies. How do we get them to the table? There's some, very well-placed companies in emerging markets who are playing in the, international arena. Are they at the table or not? And how do we bring them to the table? And the other is looking at how businesses in, some of the South-South relationships, how are they affecting the dialogue, and what are they bringing to the table, and are they being engaged, or are they being resistant to some of these, to where we're trying to go, engaging business and some of the goals that have been set through the Millennium Development Goals and others.
Thank you very much. We'll take another question from back there.
Hi, my name's Mia Warner. I'm with GE. And in conversations with a lot of companies, it seems that increasingly companies are doing development in business as usual. I would be interested to hear from each of you, if you were to choose a Millennium Development Goal for post-2015, what you would choose. I know John mentioned post-primary education, and Deborah mentioned some different things she'd had in conversations like non-communicable diseases and procurement, things like that. What would you choose? Thank you.
Right. It's an interesting question. I look forward to those answers. Anybody else who'd like to get in on the conversation? probably the last round. Remember, there are no silly questions. Yeah, there we go. The gentleman right here.
The issue was raised.
Just let us know who you are as well.
Mark Ingram, CEO, Business for Millennium Development. The issue was raised earlier about how an NGO can deal both with criticism appropriately of companies and on the other hand collaboratively, positively partner with them. We deal with the pariah ExxonMobil in Papua New Guinea. They're doubling the GDP of that country. Their critical issue is that no NGO wants to partner with them. How do you reconcile that dynamic tension?
That's an interesting question. If nobody else wants to ask anything, maybe we'll start with that one. No? Okay. Chris, how do you balance the two, criticizing while also collaborating?
Well, that's a big challenge, and I'd say it faces many NGOs. You might divide the world of NGOs into three segments. There are those that are ready to collaborate with anybody, and that's quite a large number of NGOs, and don't really have these concerns so much about the broader window dressing or other branding. You have a world of NGOs quite a bit smaller and way underfunded that are just on the outside attacking. And they always punch above their weight because, or they increasingly do because of all the new media. So it doesn't take that much actually to scandalize a company, even if you're down in East Timor and you just have an internet. So you have that group. And then you have this growing middle segment of groups like Oxfam, and I would put even some of the traditional outsiders like Greenpeace and others in it, that have moved from an outside position towards more of a collaborative. And we've done that, I'd say, in large part because we realized that we couldn't be effective if we were always pushing from the outside, but we weren't ready to sit at the table and try to solve problems. But on the other hand, if we're only at the table solving or trying to solve problems, who's going to incentivize companies from the outside and keep them honest? And there was that need to, I think, do both. So we've tried to carve that out. In many cases, we've been able to do it. I'll take the case of Newmont. We will support partners who are very vocal in their criticisms of Newmont mining, and we'll bring them to the shareholder meeting, and they'll lobby, and they'll advocate, and they'll criticize. And yet we know that Newmont is ready to step up on certain important issues, and we'll collaborate with them on those issues. And we'll do it in a way that we hope we can explain ourselves to the public, and it won't compromise our own brand too much in doing that. I'd say one way that we try to do that is by avoiding direct partnerships and trying to do it more as a stakeholder group. So if it were Exxon in a particular country, if the government were willing to come to the table, and Exxon and a few other companies and 10 NGOs, Oxfam would probably support that process and engage with it. But if it's Exxon turning to Oxfam to help them solve a particular issue, then it's much tougher for us.
Great. I'll try and answer the question. One of the questions is around the sort of engagement between sort of head office and the regions and local operations. I think it's a great question. It's one we sort of grapple with all the time. You know, it's between the idea and the reality, you know, lies the shadow, and how you sort of deal with that. And I think, coming back to what I said earlier, if it really is the case that the social purpose is the business purpose, then you have to get all the internal alignments right. And as anyone who works in a global company knows, that means you've got to get your budget making, your annual budget making process, you've got to get your strategic planning process right, and frankly, you've got to get your remuneration policy and your annual bonus plans, because those are the things that really do drive behaviour every day in companies. And you can say all these things that you want, but unless you really align those with it, then it ain't going to happen in any way as effectively as you need it to. And I think this is where, you know, we have to have the courage to actually say what we mean and do what we say. That would be my view. I don't think there's any other thing to it. It's really making sure it's aligned all the way through.
Great. Thank you. Jane, I think some of those questions were directed towards you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with John on the headquarter country level question. In terms of your question on national companies, again, I think the only way you can do that is either sort of sector leadership initiatives, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has done this very well, you know, include and have country level or UN Global Compact country level networks where, you know, you proactively go out and engage the larger national companies. It still doesn't take care of the medium and small enterprises, which are the most likely, as Erica was saying, to reach lower income consumers and producers. But probably the best way to do that is then through sort of supply chain linkages. But so I think sort of country level approaches are probably the only way to reach the national companies. I wasn't sure if your final question was about sort of the emergence of China and Africa, or when you said South-South, where you were.
China, Brazil, very different dialogues happening, very different business relationships being forged, very different perspectives in terms of sustainability, how they approach business.
And I think it comes to the heart of some of the challenges we haven't spoken on this panel. I think Lisa spoke earlier about the need for more holistic approach that is not only about development goals but also about security, about human rights, about sort of climate agenda. And there'd be some people who are saying the Chinese companies in Africa are doing an enormous amount on infrastructure development and things like that, and then less so on what we'd be seeing as the IFC performance standards on human rights and environmental and social performance. And I think the only way to address that, again, is frankly at the country level, and this does require government leadership, which is not always there, but I think there's a role for the UN here to do exactly what Chris has said, to try and create a sort of a national conversation, but to recognize, and I personally think it's a very positive thing, that there is going to be so much more so-called South-South trade, and that the Chinese, the Brazilians, etc., have a really important role to play.
I mean, I think that can be a force for good,
exactly.
Because I think there was the sort of European Union report talking about, this is the sort of polycentric age, and the age when there's a single global power is gone. And if I look at my own company, and I'm sure this must be true of every major global corporation, all the investment we're putting into Brazil, to China, to India, they are now moved beyond being the receiving end of things exported from New York or London, major sources of innovation and invention themselves. And for example, one of the things I'm most excited about of the way we can improve education in Africa over the next few years is an idea that's taken root in Brazil and has driven up education standards very dramatically. So I think the dynamic changes very, very significantly. So I think it can be a force for good.
Absolutely agree.
Great. Yeah, a bit of a follow-up.
Sorry, can I just respond for a second? We've had this discussion about with the Western companies participating in the dialogue about what next for MDGs, and I guess my question and my hope is that that discussion broadens out as we move forward and we look at what the future looks like.
Well, you had said, how do you get companies that aren't participating to participate? And John had mentioned it is the environment where every company wants to stand for something now, and so you have to actually be creative with your needs. So when you know what the needs are, and again, that's one of my approaches is like, I go to SAP, who's saying, we're trying to make the world run better. Oh, really? Can you help with the systems of the Global Fund? And then the employees love it, and people, give SAP, by the way, that was not a criticism, gives an enormous amount of money to the Global Fund and is in on having this Millennium Goal happen in 2015. So, Starbucks is very much about joblessness now, and you go and you check out, but you know that they're also interested in their global community and their coffee growers in developing countries, and Belvedere vodka, you could possibly think, what in the world could a vodka company do? But you know what? They have the conversation taking place on a dance floor. They have Usher coming in, letting people know where the state of AIDS is right now. There's a role for that company. Converse is about unleashing creativity. I will just say, and this is just kind of wacky to think about, with social media where it is, when we had the panel last World AIDS Day with Bono, Alicia Keys, Clinton, Bush, and Obama came. This is Thursday at 11:30 in the morning. 4 million people watched it on YouTube. I texted, so we have our social media, the people that follow RED, over 1.3 million on Facebook, Twitter, so Collectively, we have 3 million. The one organization has over 3 million activists that sign petitions, that really care. So together, we're 6 million. We go out the door and with a message. It then goes to the 20 red companies, the employees. So think Apple, Converse, Starbucks. Then it goes to their social media, the social media of Converse, which is 40 million. And so on that one moment at 11:30 on a Thursday, we say to 300 million people, this is where we are in this fight at no cost. At no cost. So it would be horrible, I think, not to think, how are you using social media? How are you using these companies? And is there another way of looking at having people buy in and perhaps even vote on what those goals should be? Not that it shouldn't be an American Idol, when Simon says, oh my God, here's the winning goal. But there is something to having their voice heard and saying, okay, Telco and all throughout Latin America, you have, it happens to be a red business and owned by Carlos Slim. Let's use that to give people a voice and that last mile that can actually text about what they care about. And if you have everybody saying at some moment, maybe it's the World Cup games, I throw it out there, it's 2014, that, at some moment, this is what we care about, and then the dialogue begins with, hearing from people, the NGOs, the business sector, and everybody comes together, and there's an awareness of what these goals are, and buy-in, that this is what everybody's going to work on. That can happen now, and it couldn't have happened before.
Right, we are pretty much out of time, but I would like to very quickly run that other question past each of the panel members, which I think is a very interesting one, which is if you had to, or could put forward a new development goal, what would that development goal be? So maybe just like 20, 30 seconds or so for each of the panelists.
I'll save you 20 seconds because I think I answered the question. Earlier on, I think I said what I would do.
Right, okay.
That's the same for me because sustainable energy for all was
sustainable energy for all. Chris?
I think it would have to do with transparency or accountability.
Okay.
Mine would also be accountability and transparency both for governments and certain criteria and integrating natural sort of capital accounting into GDP, gross domestic product accounting, and for companies to have to report on their overall sustainability.
Right.
Preventable diseases, get them off the planet.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Plenty more to discuss, but very lively panel. Join me in thanking them. And